Hello, everyone. Aloha. So it's afternoon after lunch, right? So, put a little love in your heart. Isn't that a song? Put a little love in your heart. You got love in your heart? Okay. How many were here yesterday? Okay, so a fair number were here yesterday. Okay, so I just want to start out with this because I forgot to do this yesterday. So those who were here yesterday, you heard me talk about a gentleman who became a Baha'i, who was very angry at the Baha'i community and got upset, and he was an artist and da-da-da-da-da. Well, I brought some of his prints of Louis Gregory, and this is a picture of Louis Gregory that's displayed in the To Move the World and other places. I brought these to sell for him for $35 a piece. So those $35 a piece, which is a steal, so if you want to pay 40 or 50, it's fine. But 35 minimum. At the end of this session, should you like to buy one of these, he would love it. So praise God. I just wanted to make sure. I should have brought those yesterday. He lives in Washington, D.C. Yeah, he still lives in Washington, D.C. So the thing that we did yesterday and today, this is really a snapshot of a day or a day and a half workshop that we do where we can really dive into these subjects. We're kind of scratching the surface in some ways, and so if your community is interested in this, please let me know. We're trying to do fundraising so we can cover our expenses. We've got a nonprofit, so we don't want communities to have to pay anything when they bring us. So I saw somebody raising money for their nonprofit, so I feel like emboldened to say we have a nonprofit, and if anybody wants to contribute, they can, so that we can take this workshop really on the road. I want to also say something real briefly about yesterday. One of the things that came up near the end was the issues of equality of women and men, and Ken addressed it, I thought, very profoundly. And it's one of these things. I have 2 daughters and 3 granddaughters and a wife and a lot of women in my household, and we've had many discussions because of the things that have come up in the news lately. And I think the way Ken described the racial issues in his talk, he said they're not new, they just got unmasked. And I think the gender issues are not new, I think they just have become unmasked in the media, right? And so we don't have time to deal with that here today, but as a man who needs to own the equality of women and men, as Abdul Baha told me to do, I just wanted to suggest that we as men take an opportunity, really because of what's come in the news and because of our teachings, just to do some personal reflections on our own attitudes about the equality of women. I don't mean right now, I mean when we leave here, as we go into our world and know that we are a part of our society and we also have attitudes and behaviors, maybe not the kind that we've seen on the news, maybe not that dramatic, but we all can contribute in our attitudes and our behaviors and our consciousness toward our treatment of women. I think it's something we need to give consideration to. And I wouldn't feel faithful to Abdul Baha, or I wouldn't feel faithful to my wife and my daughters had I not said something about this. And if I go home and they ask me, I want to be able to say I mentioned it because it's from my heart. So yesterday, and I feel like we need to do just a brief review, and then we had some questions at the end of the session, and some people were in line, they had some questions. So after I go through this brief review, we want to see if people still have some of those questions, and Ken has a couple things he wants to say. And then we're going to continue to talk about these methods and approaches that the House of Justice indicated would be capable of removing every instrument devised by humanity for one group to oppress another, that we want to talk more about some of those methods and approaches. And so yesterday we talked about where racial prejudice is right now and what the House of Justice said about racial prejudice. And one of the things they said is that it has systematically been impressed upon the consciousness of the individuals and the structures of our society. So this is what the House of Justice said, that it's systematically been impressed upon the consciousness of the individual and the structures of our society, and in some ways it's more intractable than it was in the past. It's more complicated, it's more complex, it's more ingrained, maybe perhaps than it has been in the past. And when they said that it's systematically impressed on our consciousness, one of the things that became clear is that if it's systematically impressed in our consciousness, we need a system to remove it. And this is what the House of Justice is trying to give us, is a system to remove it. So that was one of the things that we talked about. Another thing we talked about was when Ken talked about Paducah, Kentucky in his talk, I shared some more background about that. And the reason I did that was because in looking at the community building activities, and the House of Justice is saying that addressing race, again, can be done within the expansion and consolidation, within public discourse and social action. These three major areas, they said that's an integral part. Addressing racial prejudice is an integral part of these three major areas. And so when I heard Ken tell the story of Paducah, Kentucky, I started to think of the background of the ways that they have come about engaging all three of these, expansion and consolidation, public discourse, and social action. And it wasn't really in the traditional way. It wasn't door to door, it wasn't meeting youth in parks and talking to them, which is fine and great. But I think we also need to expand the possibilities of engaging people in the community building activities. And I thought this was a creative example because they started with a sincere desire to address race in their community. That's all they wanted to do, to serve, not necessarily even with the intent of enrollments, but to serve their community from their heart because these racial issues were profound and needed to be addressed. And so what they did was they decided to have these dialogues on race, and they brought this movie called Racial Taboo, and they showed it to 300, 400, 500 members of their community. They started a year-long dialogue, which several people came to, including the mayor and the sheriffs and pastors, and really heads of government throughout the city. They did this for over a year and a half. They did some social action projects. They did all this in the name of one of the Baha'is who had passed away there and had been active in addressing race relations. And so they really started out with discourse. And they really started out with social action in one sense, right? But what Ken shared was now these pastors, some of these pastors have come together and they want to look at our community building activities. They want to look at the junior youth activities and they want to support the junior youth activities in their community. Now that's profound. They've looked at them and they've said, and they've even said that even if some people are concerned about that, some pastors are concerned about that, they still want to do it. So in some ways you could think, well, that kind of went backwards. It started with social action and public discourse, and it led to potentially expansion and consolidation activities. But I think the point is, each of our communities has to assess, as the House of Justice told us, the social reality on the ground. The social reality for that community was they probably weren't going to be capable initially to really start too many community building activities, but their heart was in addressing race, and so they did it with sincerity. Again, part of the reality and truth-telling from the podium is that we have to expand the ways that we address the community building activities. We have to become more and more creative about that. And again, the National Spiritual Assembly and its recent letter on the Spirit on Teaching was truly, in one sense, part of that letter was conveying, let's try stuff. Let's think outside the box. Let's be creative. There's not one size fits all. Now, we've said that many times over the years, but I think we really have to take that to heart. So that was one of the things we talked about yesterday. We began to look at the methods and approaches within the community building process that, let me just put this slide up here. Okay, so we began to look at the methods and approaches within the community building process that can, again, remove oppression. And that we needed to start to understand, if the House of Justice said the methods and approaches that they've given us in the community building process can remove the oppression from our society, it's really the purpose for which Baha'u'llah came, is to free people from bondage and to free people and to make sure people have true liberty. And so it seems to me if they say that these methods and approaches can remove oppression from our society, that we really have to dig our heels in and figure out what they mean. You know, I don't think we know yet. I don't think we're used to thinking about addressing race systematically. Is that true in our Baha'i community? Have we addressed it systematically at any time in our history? Okay, so it's hard to wrap our mind around what they could be talking about when we don't have anything to draw on from experience. What we have to draw on, which the passage said earlier, was fits and starts. where they said some people are on the sidelines, we start something with fanfare, things wane, and then we kind of renew the cycle over and over again. That's how we're used to thinking about addressing race. And so we really got to wrap our heads around, okay, what are they saying? How can I think outside the ways I've thought about doing this in the past? So we began to address that. And we addressed it because the House of Justice said the ways that we did things in the past had merits, but they were limited. So in other words, there was nothing wrong with them. Just like there was nothing wrong with mass teaching. We did mass teaching and it was a wonderful thing, but it had limitations, right? So they said simply to repeat the patterns of the past would not produce satisfactory results. If we just went out and did mass teaching again without this community building system, would we produce the results that we want? If we want to address race unity and just go out and do it the way we did it before, are we going to produce the results we want? And so we felt like we need to really dig into those methods and approaches. We also realized that we cannot focus simply on the Baha'i community, that there's dichotomous thinking that we have to get our act together, our house in order, before we can reach out to the broader community, where the House of Justice says we have to engage with the broader community, and as we engage with the broader community, we will together discover how to address race. And they were very specific about it. They said that we need to engage within the neighborhoods, within the clusters, within our communities, in our outreach efforts, and they said through engagement, we will get experience, we consult on that experience, and then we learn. And they said that will lead to a change in, let me get this right, that will lead to a change in personal and collective understanding and action. So, we engage with the broader community within the context of these community building activities. We get experience about how to relate to people across race, class, and culture. We consult about that experience, and we come to some understanding, and we learn, and we continue to do that over and over, but we don't do it in isolation just within our community, because the House of Justice said, even if we put all of our resources into eliminating racial prejudice in our communities, the results would be, the word they used was inconsequential. Okay? So, we've got to do both at the same time, improve ourselves and improve the broader community. And so they gave us some, what I have come to term, and this is not the House of Justice language, and I apologize if anybody's offended I'm not using the House of Justice language, but they said that we need to engage, right? And so I said, how are they telling us to engage with people? They said, as we reach out in the neighborhood, these are the ways that we need to engage. And I gave you a handout that has all of these things and more. And it's entitled Rules of Engagement or something like that on the top. And what this is the language of the Universal House of Justice when they tell us how we need to reach out to the broader community, the attitudes, the behaviors, the habits that we need to concentrate on, because these are part of the methods and approaches that are going to begin to break down barriers across race, class, and culture. When I assume an attitude of utmost humility as I'm talking to people across race, across culture, that sets up a new dynamic, particularly if people are expecting me to have an attitude of superiority. And what happens when I approach another human being across race, class, and culture with the utmost humility? And they know I want to hear what they have to say. They know that their input into this community building process, into the things in society are important, and I make that clear. That's healing to people. That's acknowledgement to people. That's appreciation. That creates a consultative environment where we say everybody is at the table. And you know, the Baha'i International Community said that consultation is the operating expression of justice in human affairs. Think about that. Consultation is the operating expression of justice in human affairs. So when we create the condition of consultation with other people, we are creating justice in human affairs. So these activities that we're doing, the children's classes and the junior youth classes, we need to do them in these ways. When we engage in conversation with people in the neighborhoods, we need to do it in this way and invite consultation, invite their input, and do it in that attitude. And in doing that, we are expressing and creating conditions of justice. And so, in my mind, I have started to call these activities, instead of just children's classes and activities, I'm calling them unity building, oneness building, and justice building activities. This is unity building, justice building, and oneness building language. Also, we realize that when we engage in these kinds of behaviors, the House of Justice, or excuse me, I'm calling the NSA the House of Justice, my mistake. The National House of Justice, when they wrote their February 25th letter, said that we have to deal with the harsh realities honestly, but we have to appeal to the nobler aspirations. As we engage with people with this in mind, we appeal to the nobler aspirations while dealing with the harsh realities. And so those are some of the general things that we talked about yesterday. I wanted to address one thing, too, that came up. Because somebody said, like, they're in a homogeneous community. And how do we begin to deal with these things in a homogeneous community? And again, this is an exploratory process, so we're learning as we go. But one of the things that I think we have to understand about these activities, these unity-building, justice-building activities, these study circles, for example, where we study the creative word, where we look at what it means to be a human being from a spiritual context, where we reflect on the life of the Spirit. This helps to shape a new identity in people, in all of us. We start to see ourselves in different ways as we engage in these study circles and children's classes. We start to see ourselves as servants, as spiritual beings. That starts to happen within the methods and approaches. And when we start to do that, we start to look at things differently. So I'll just give you an example of one thing that happened in our community, and that's the only thing I can share is what I know from the community I'm in. There was a group of people at a school, and they were doing junior youth programs there. And when they started the junior youth programs, there was a Hispanic group and there was an African American group, and they didn't want to come together. So they started a junior youth group for the Hispanic group, they started a junior for the Latino group, and they started a junior youth group for the black folks. And so after a while, after they were engaged in this junior youth program for a while, because of the nature of the methods that they were approaching, the materials they were studying, the attitudes that the animators had, these groups asked if they could come together. They asked, this is no exaggeration, and the counselor in that school said that they had had a lot of programs that came through there, but none of them had brought the blacks and the Hispanics together. And so my point is that even in a homogeneous neighborhood, when you're doing things, as people's sense of who they are gets elevated, hopefully a desire to interact with people across race will come, and they will want to do things because they will start to understand who they are and what this message is of oneness and the oneness of the human family. So those are parts of the subtle parts of the methods and approaches that start to change how people view other people. So I just wanted to say that as kind of another example. And so with that, at the end of yesterday's session, we had some questions, and we ran out of time. And so we wanted to, as we talked together, Ken had a few things to share, but we also wanted to make sure if people had questions from yesterday, either about what we talked about yesterday, perhaps about Ken's talk, perhaps about the February 25th letter, or even just your experiences in the community building activities, particularly as it relates to addressing issues of race, class, and culture, that if you have those questions, we'll take about maybe 10 minutes or so, or around there, más o menos? Somewhere in there. We'll see how it goes. But and Ken, I think you were going to share a couple of things as well, I believe. Well, whenever you're ready. Okay, all right. And please come to the microphone for those who would like to. Would you mind coming to the mic? And John Gear, you had said something at the end too, and I apologize from yesterday that I didn't get all of what you said. Please. So we'll take a. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a remote. I guess there's a remote, or you can stand here, whatever you.
Hi, I'm Bob Cronemeyer from Elkhart, Indiana, near South Bend. Elkhart, in the last 6 months, I said the population within the city of Elkhart is about 12% black, but there is a community center there called the Tolson Center, which was set up for primarily serving the black underserved area. But now there is dialogue in the community, and among one activist in particular, calling about structural racism within the government or within the community. So how do you address that? Yes. You're the expert. No, it's just the mayor, who actually I know, But he's trying to be sensitive to that, but, I mean, there is this phrase, this structural racism. So, I mean, it's like, I interpret it as really rooted within the community. And how do you address, or how do you try to unravel that?
Read the Prayer for Humanity from Abdul Baha. That's one step. Prayer is important. It's critical, right? It's vital for everything we do. I don't have one answer to that. I think that structural racism is real. That's what the House of Justice said. They said structural racism. As individuals, there's a number of activities we can engage in to address these things. We can address these things, Ken mentioned them yesterday, through social actions, through collaborating with organizations, et cetera, et cetera. As a Baha'i community, we have to build capacity. And we have to build capacity to address these things at the root of where they come from, right? How many people are addressing these things at the root, at the core of understanding the oneness of the human family? So I think as Baha'i communities, we have to consider, we can couple with agencies that are doing things like that. But our Baha'i community doesn't have the capacity to break down all of the structures and all of the challenges that exist in the community, whether it be institutional racism around education, institutional racism around the criminal justice system, institutional racism in all of our systems. Our capacity is not there yet. Our capacity to assist, to engage with people, to be good citizens, to help people do those things in ways that they're doing them are very important. We have to be part of our community, and I think the House of Justice tells us that. But we also have to build the capacity of the people within the neighborhoods and the communities to be able to address these things for themselves. Right? So it's not leaders addressing this, it's the capacity of a community to address its own problem. And this is where the House of Justice, again, we expand and consolidate, we get involved in discourse because the people in the communities decide what it is they need to address within their communities, and then we engage in social action. And the key is we have to expand greatly in numbers so we have the capacity to deal with larger and larger issues, right? But it's going to come from the grassroots deciding what the people need for themselves. So individually we engage with people as we decide to do that, and we should. We shouldn't be separate from the broader community. But I think the Baha'i community really has something to offer in getting at the roots of this. And I think that's what the House of Justice has given us. So I don't have any other answer. You said expert. I'm not an expert. I'm learning in this process. Okay, so a couple other questions. We aren't going to be able to get to the depth of all these questions, and I apologize for that. I'm not trying to be glib. So if you ask me a question, I'll give you a short answer, because that's all we have time for.
Actually, now, my comment yesterday pertained to what exactly getting to the root. And my recollection was that back in 1998, the two Continental Counselors, Dr. Abdul Misaq Adirian and Tod Ewing, had a session for the board members. And I remember this, the whole session was, the weekend, was about racial issues. And one thing I remember that really was etched on my soul was the fact that the issue of addressing the racial issues is a matter of covenant. The access, Abdul Baha says, the access of the unity of mankind is the covenant of Baha'u'llah. And then we know that he also said the prerequisite to establishing the ascendancy of America in leading all nations spiritually is a resolution of this issue of racism. So the two of them, if you put it on one side of the equation, they equal the same thing, the unity of human race. So I wanted your expansion of this comment on addressing really the core issue that each of us don't have an option when it relates to something related to the covenant of Baha'u'llah. We need to engage and be more active and forthcoming.
Yes, I guess the question regarding structural racism or how to approach it or deconstruct it I think when we say structural racism, we're equating that with institutional racism. And I don't know how many of the friends here attended Professor Derek Smith's talk on institutional racism. It was 2 days ago, right? Is there a show of hands? So if I misstate anything that Derek shared, please correct me. This was kind of my takeaway, but it was a very fascinating approach on institutional racism. Derek broke down what is an institution. So very academically, he started to break it down. And the reality is the institution or institutions are nothing more than an extension of an individual or individuals, a collective group. And in fact, the best way to get at the root of institutional racism is to engage the individuals who are the most influential within that particular institution. Because this is how racism or any form of prejudice operates within that institution. It's individuals who are giving it space, giving it life, giving it effect. So I would think to approach to the question of structural racism or how to approach it is to at some level or at some point engage with the individuals within the structure, within the institution, whatever that is, city government, schools, universities, communities. My 2 cents, I don't know. And was that Derek Smith's? Yeah. Okay.
Well, I have a question. I'm a college student, and in college, there's a large number I found in the discussion that I try to have about race. There's a large group of students, a good amount of people, who don't believe that institutional racism, systematic racism is a thing, that there is no greedy racist at the top that's deciding not to hire this race and to hire this race. And often they're armed with statistics about whatever type of race in whatever workplace that will support that opinion. And no matter what you say about, usually I say, what if, we're hearing these complaints, how can we invalidate their legitimate concerns and say that they're illegitimate? And that's how I've kind of opened the discussion so far. But I'm curious how maybe it would be best to approach that mindset that doesn't see it as a problem. So it's one thing to engage with someone and to try to address an issue. How do you even get them to start seeing it as an issue, to get them to start realizing that it is something that they should be concerned about? And this is open to anyone that maybe has more experience in opening the dialogue with that type of person, because I'm curious how other people do it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that one of the most useful tools in our, especially college communities, is the arts and storytelling and creating opportunities to create empathy. Because not understanding or not knowing the facts or knowing the statistics, it gets to be really cumbersome for people who are not living in that skin. So I think obviously if we're not living in the skin, it's hard for us to identify with that. And to not use the arts to at least engage in the real history. I work in theater, and I found that when we present stories and then create opportunities for conversation after those stories, true stories, it's really hard to use intellectual reasoning and not deal with the conscience. So developing empathy, developing conscience, I think is really the only answer. Otherwise, we're never going through the back door, which is our spiritual capacity.
Okay. Do we want to continue with the questions, or would we like to hold on to them? Okay.
I think this was a very great answer that Mayor gave just now, and that was my first instinct too. Is it's really about how do you open hearts, because if our modern media teaches us nothing else, it's that people will believe anything. intellectually. They're just ready to accept any evidence that supports a preconceived worldview and reject anything that does not support that worldview. So we're stuck, in a sense, unless there's some way forward that creates openings in people's hearts. And I couldn't agree more that use of the arts is one of these very valuable resources that we have. But one can also take a look at the fundamental aspects of our community building process, of which the arts are a very important component, because they are specifically promoted in the sequence of courses, and the ways in which they open spiritual bonds in the sense of fellow feeling, in the sense of openness to the experiences of others. And when that atmosphere has been created, by whatever means, through prayer, resort to the Word of God, through friendship, through all the things that happen in spaces like that, then one begins to be more ready to accept the legitimacy of the perspectives of others. Sometimes it may not be the first thing that we're able to do with people, that is to say, well, there's another way of looking at this, and maybe they won't respond to that. But maybe there's another way that prepares the soul to be able to look at things in a different kind of a way. And I think it's a great question and a very profound one, because in the end also, we don't want to go down the road of being dismissive of those, even if their initial reaction is not the one we would hope that they would have. We don't want to be also among the dividers in our assumptions and in the attitudes that we take, but rather give every opportunity that we can that's fair and reasonable for people to respond with whatever, there's an inner nobility in all of us, and wherever that is, to find that and to bring that out to the extent that their receptivity allows. Well, Tod and I were talking a little bit. Now, first of all, may I just personally thank Tod for his facilitation so far of these two sessions. I'm actually a very intelligent guy, smarter than I look, and I knew that when I asked Tod to co-facilitate this with me, I would probably end up sitting in my chair for most of the time while he did the professional work of facilitating, which he has done admirably well. But we did have a lot of consultation leading up to it. One of the things we talked about together was another aspect of the meeting that the National Spiritual Assembly members had with members of the Universal House of Justice, which might also shed a little bit of light on the perspective that the House of Justice encouraged the Assembly to take with respect to addressing the issue of race. And that discussion began first with sort of a revisiting of the entire notion of a spiritual assembly. What is a spiritual assembly? And we began with this wonderful phrase of Bahala''s when he ordains the establishment of houses of justice, and said that those who are chosen to be members of houses of justice should consider themselves as the guardians, the trustees of the merciful, and the guardians appointed of God for all who dwell on earth. The trustees of the merciful and the guardians appointed of God for all who dwell on earth. So the implication there, of course, is that while we may be the spiritual assembly of Phoenix, of the Baha'is of Phoenix, yet, and that's in an immediate sense, yet in a larger sense, we must also have the vision that it is the spiritual assembly of the people of Phoenix, the entire citizenry of Phoenix, whether or not all of the members of Phoenix are Baha'is, in terms of the attitude of service that an assembly has towards all the people, and the things in which it would eventually wish to do to engage in the betterment of an entire community, and not the betterment only for the benefit, let's say, of the members of the Baha'i faith. So this is a really a wonderful, universal kind of attitude to have. And so in addressing this question, we then address the question, well, then how does this sense of guardianship of all people manifest itself? And in the first place, of course, it is the building of the Baha'i community. That is, it's the expansion and the consolidation and the building of patterns of life that more and more, and in a very direct sense, reflect the splendor of the teachings of Baha'u'llah and serve as a model from which we can learn and which others can learn and eventually learn to emulate. The Guardian made a very powerful statement about this, that he said, ultimately, the people will not enter the faith in large numbers until they see a pattern in action of something better than that which they already have. So they won't. Why would they do that unless they can see something that's actually working? Yesterday I said, you have to have a plan. Well, that's what we're trying to do, is to build those patterns of activity. So experience and capacity building is key among those with whom we are working directly. But there are also other levels of engagement. There is social action, that is to say, disinterested projects of service that we undertake for the benefit of others, and that others also join with us in for the betterment of a community as a whole. Now, when I say disinterested, I mean what Tod was saying earlier, in that the motivation is sheer service, and not, if I do something nice, maybe this guy will come to a fireside. When Abdu'l-Baha gave his robe or his cloak, we know he wasn't thinking to himself, if I'm nice to this guy, maybe he'll be interested in the Baha'i faith. No, it was, and he'll come to my talk, that I'm giving in New York. That wasn't the idea. It sounds, I don't mean to sound disrespectful or glib, speaking of the master, but we have to remind ourselves of this purity of spirit that motivates service. But an assembly, just as individuals, are responsible for the question, how do we inculcate the spirit of service to the world? The other is the engagement in discourses of society. And again, it's a disinterested engagement, as Tod was very clear to explain. That is to say that we have a sincere, agenda-free purpose to advance a conversation with our countrymen on various issues that are of importance to our future as a country, and to the future of humanity. And the question is, by what means do we build the capacity better and better to engage and actually successfully to advance that discussion? So the issue that we talked about with the members of the House of Justice was the issue of race. And it was in that context that this notion of a national race unity conference came out. It was actually ventured by a member of the Universal House of Justice. And there were a couple of levels on that. One of them was, it's nearly a century now since the first Race Amity Conference was held in the United States. And this was Louis Gregory and Agnes Parsons who held this conference at the behest of Abdu'l-Baha himself. And it was, there were a few other events of that sort, but then eventually it sort of petered out. And it speaks to this challenge that Tod has expressed, in which the House of Justice answered that, that was a worthy endeavor, but it wasn't systematic, it wasn't sustained. So the question is not to once again just have an event that then a few years later we're going, well, gee, we had our event and what now? That kind of a thing. But to consider a race unity conference as part of a larger process. And I was quite impressed with some of the comments of the members of the House of Justice, and I'll share them. Then we received subsequent guidance for the National Assembly, and I think there's value in that guidance, in thinking how we take on this issue at a local level. The House of Justice, first of all, has laid a particular responsibility on national assemblies around the world to identify topics of urgent concern in their respective societies, and to advance that conversation. Now, by that, of course, is meant to bring to bear insights from the revelation of Baha'u'llah into that conversation, so that that conversation more and more benefits from those insights, from those teachings of Baha'u'llah. The House of Justice said that for national assemblies, we have to pick our topic, and then we have to systematically learn how to do that until we actually succeed in having a great impact on the national conversation on such and such. Now, in the United States, imagine actually changing the whole national conversation about race as Baha'is. Imagine that. But this was the challenge that they set for us. What your goal is to change the whole national conversation on race in America. And they said two things about that challenge. One, you have to approach this with a sense of urgency and boldness. I can't tell you how many times the word bold was used, and the word courageous. I don't want to count them because, Puran, I know I'm not supposed to do that, but the point was, that they were clear, that. And I loved the spirit of what Mrs. Stevens was just saying, because yes, we just have to get out there and do it, and we have to feel urgently about it. But we also have to be thoughtful about it. Not just frenetic, and not just we did a few things and we were all full of energy, but then it kind of died away. The other thing they said, be urgent and have a long view. Let's be realistic. To change the whole conversation about race in the United States won't be because you had one race unity conference. It will be because you had a growing dialogue with people in the United States who are leaders of thought at the national level and who in turn helped you to advance that conversation over a period of many years. And one of the members said, is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 50 years? Whatever it is, we have to be thoughtful in our approach until we get there, until we have the capacity to do it. So we received guidance from the Universal House of Justice, which has not been, I don't think has been published, but it essentially described 5 elements for national spiritual assemblies in their pursuit of engagement and discourse at the national level. But perhaps there's value, even for us as individuals or us who serve in local communities. First, learn the nature of the discourse that now is taking place. So where race is concerned, there's a lot of discourse going on in the United States. What are they saying about it? Who are the players? Who's doing the talking? And what is the nature of that discussion? Now, to find that out, of course, you can read and you can research and all of that sort of a thing. But one of the most important things you can do is go to the spaces that are being created to talk about those issues. Now, I want to assure you, friends, that for the past year, we've been very actively inhabiting those spaces that are being created by academic institutions and other organizations and NSA members, but also representatives of the National Assembly in growing numbers are going to those conferences. And now, actually, we're at the point now we're actually presenting at some of those conferences. And we're learning what is being said and how it's being talked about. What are the strengths of the arguments that are being presented? What are the pitfalls of those arguments? But most of all, what do these discussions suggest as to what the Baha'i contribution might be to the discussion? This is the humble posture of learning. It means that we don't go into our situation assuming that because we're Baha'is, we have all the answers and it's just for everyone else to be quiet and we'll tell them. But the acknowledgement that there are many wonderful people thinking deeply about these issues and have a lot to say, a lot to offer, whose own insights can refine our sense of what Baha'u'llah had to say. So they can bring understanding to us of our own faith sometimes. It's true when we interact with them in that spirit. So this is step one. Now, step two is to begin creating our own spaces where we test some of the ideas that we have based on that experience. And we've already begun doing that. We've begun in Washington, D.C. We've had a series of, if you will, mini race unity conferences. Now, we haven't advertised them to the community, but what we've done is we've invited selected Baha'is with whom we're working and members of the NGO community, that is the non-governmental organizations in D.C., and the interfaith community to come to our office and we test concepts with them. We think, all right, well, maybe this would be helpful and illuminating, and maybe they can shed some light. And we have discussions with them over the course of a couple of days to test Baha'i concepts to see if they resonate, if they help, if they assist. And we learn to refine our sense of what works and what doesn't through that course of action. And we're steadily now pursuing that on a very regular, a quarterly basis. We're creating these spaces. Now, eventually, those little spaces will get bigger and bigger until we have a national race unity conference at some point, hopefully before long. Now, the third element is to begin to identify collaborators who seem to be like-minded, who are comfortable with a nonpartisan agenda, and who we believe, now, not members of the Baha'i faith, but whether as professionals or academics or human rights leaders or what have you, can work with us to advance that conversation in a more profound and deeper way. So they become our allies, our helpers, if you will, in advancing the conversation. So we're at the table, but these guys are also at the table, really as our collaborators. The fourth element is to identify from within the community Baha'is who have special experience, some of them professional experience. I mean, Tod is a wonderful example of one of our collaborators from within the faith, but there are quite a few people who have devoted their lives to questions of race and diversity and understanding how to transcend these barriers and work together to dissolve these barriers that happen between people. And also increasingly now, in various parts of the country, we have at the very grassroots of our community people who have been working in neighborhoods and whose pursuit of the elements of the plan have begun to result in the emergence of patterns of activity that also are beginning to dissolve these barriers of prejudice. And of course, you just heard one example of that. And this, by the way, friends, is an extremely important point. It leads to the fifth element, and the fifth element is creation of content. So from all of this experience, from all of these perspectives, we create content that we hope actually advances the conversation on race, but content that has two important features. One, I'll say three. One, of course, is description of principle, description of values, or description of assumptions about reality. And these are the principles like the oneness of humanity and the equality of all races and so on and so forth that we're familiar with. However, what we learn in the world of public affairs, and at the BIC and in Washington, D.C., is that a simple iteration over and over again of high-level principle by itself is extremely unsatisfactory to people. Because after a while, it's, okay, all right, we get it. You love everybody, you want peace, you want unity, fine, got it. You don't need to issue another statement. You know what I mean? What they want to see is, how do you tie those ideals to something that actually has happened, that show that you're learning how to apply those ideals and you're getting a result? So there's this question of how we tie the principle to the world of experience. And this is an extremely important notion that the House of Justice emphasized with us, and that experience can mean many things. It can be a neighborhood experience or a Tod Ewing style experience or what have you, but the idea that, yes, we have these concepts, we have these principles, but if you will, they are testable propositions. You know what I mean? They're scientific. We have them, but we apply them. And as we apply them, we learn things about change. The important thing there, of course, is not to presume for a moment that we have achieved any nirvana state of perfection, in the application of these things, but always to think of ourselves as a community that's continually in learning mode. But something has been learned, and whatever the insights that have come from that experience are what we marry to those principles, so that people can say, so you believe things, but you're also doing things. And these things are very, very important as well. So a race unity conference then becomes an important milestone in an ongoing process that also has an actionable component. In other words, the final thing about the content is that as we continue into the future, what we hope will happen is gatherings like that and content that is produced for such gatherings then leads to other actions that are inspired by that interaction. That it begins to affect not only what people think, but what then people go do in their communities, whether or not they're Baha'is. So they can say later at the next Race Unity Conference, I heard that insight that you shared, and I went back, and here's what we did, and now I've got something to share. Do you know what I mean? So it really becomes a true laboratory of learning that we're beginning to create that goes on into the years of the future. And I think these may be sort of disciplines, if you will, or methods of approach that help us as we, even in our own individual services, as well as in services on local assemblies, can take as guidelines in how we might think about approaching this issue. Yeah? Yeah.
No, I agree with what he just said. How's that? Let me see what time it is. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left. Let's see. Warp speed here. There's a couple things. I'm trying to think what seems to be the priority. I want to share just a little bit about the handouts you have just for a minute. Did you? Got it. Remind me if I forget. Okay, so here's a couple things. One, you've got a handout of the American the 5-Year Plan letter, and you see that there's some bolded parts of that letter. and then you have a question and answer type thing sheet that, if you look at it very carefully, we kind of made this easy. We bolded the part where the answers are. And then right by the question, we put the number of the paragraph, right? So all you got to do is go through, study it, ask the question, and look for the bolded part of that paragraph, and you'll find it. Now, I'm saying that, and we're sharing this because, one of the things that it seems, as Ken and I were talking, that lacks in the Baha'i community right now is a unity of vision about how to address race. And part of the February 25th letter is to help us look at what the National Spiritual Assembly is asking us to do. And so if this study guide and this letter helps, my encouragement would be that you go back, and this is one thing that everybody here can do, is go back and engage with people around this letter. Engage with them in terms of establishing the sense of a unity of a vision of how to move forward. Just a suggestion, encouragement, etc. So the other thing I wanted to say is yesterday, and I'm going to not do this to the slides as much as I had intended to, it really doesn't matter, but the point of it is that when I started telling you the story about, we call him Brother Daniel, the guy who got angry at the community and made it clear. And we all grew, as I said, as a result of that. But I want to share one thing about this. It's important. Part of the reason that the community was able to sustain and understand what it is that we needed to do is because the LSA was helping to guide the process. And this is critical. Because what's happened in the past is you often have individuals who feel passionately about race and they try to raise it, and then if the institutions aren't engaged, people can ignore it, or they can just decide, let those people do it, and nobody else is going to be engaged. But in our community, the LSA several years ago started talking about this issue and how we could guide our community to begin addressing this within the context of the community building activities. So we wanted to set an example because the House of Justice said, initially, if I can find this, okay. Initially, in the April 10th letter, they talk about all the areas that we can address race within. And these are all the areas they mentioned. They say through all the study circles, children's classes, reflection gatherings, all of this is in context of addressing race. They say we can address it within all of this. So the local spiritual assembly started thinking about how can we encourage that? So what it did was we started having some deepenings in our community. So there's this base of knowledge that we were starting to gain. We started studying the April 10th letter. But the other thing that we did is we asked ourselves this simple question, and this is something we've been doing for 2 or 3 years now, and now some of the agencies, the ATC, the core team, etc., are asking themselves this question. When we make a decision or we're about to move forward with something in the community, we ask ourselves, are there any racial, cultural, or class implications to this decision that we need to think about? Okay? We ask ourselves that question or a variation of that question, and I can tell you it's changed some of our decisions. It changed where we had the bicentenary celebration. There was this wonderful, beautiful facility we could have had the bicentenary celebration in that would have been befitting to Baha'u'llah, but we decided to make a high school befitting because it was more accessible, particularly to the people of African descent in that city. Now, had we not asked ourselves what are the racial, cultural, or class implications to where we're holding this event, that may not have come up. A second thing that happened, I'm just giving you an example of the importance of this, because what happens is prejudice and bias is subconscious sometimes. So you've got to bring it to the surface, and you have to ask yourself questions and catch yourself. And so the second thing, and this is just one example of another thing that we did, we were hiring resident managers to serve the Baha'i Center. And we had 3 applicants, 2 couples, 1 single guy. And it's a 2-person job. I mean, doing the Baha'i Center caretaker, resident manager, no way one person should be able to do that job. So we interviewed these couples, and we interviewed this one guy, really with the intent that we were going to hire one of these couples. And we had this nice white couple, and they were amazing. On paper, they had every possible qualification you could think of. And then this one guy came in. He's indigenous to Washington, D.C., African American. And he shared his vision of the center. And after we listened to him talk, we stepped back and said, really, what is our real criteria? What do we really need at the Baha'i Center? Is it just the physical facility that we need to take care of? Or what is the image we want to present when people walk through that door? Who do we want them to see? We want them to see the indigenous believers in Washington, D.C. He's quite capable. Now, he can do the things that other people can do, but we said we'll have to figure out a way to support that because one person can't do this. But what's important, more important than just the maintenance of the center, is the fact that we are raising the capacity, raising the potential of individual indigenous people. He became the resident manager. And let me tell you, when the LSA made that decision, I am telling you, Abdul Baha came in that room. This is a small decision, but now he's on the local spiritual assembly. He's one of the first indigenous believers to be on the local spiritual assembly. And the point I'm trying to make is the LSA has guided this process. And so when the time came and we were doing outreach in the community, and this white girl went up to this guy and she started talking to him, he started cussing us out, the community had some experience talking about race, class, and culture. And so we were able to address this, absorb it within the study circles, which created a whole new dynamic of relationships for him, because now he's talking with white people, and white people are talking to him. He's talking to Persians, Persians are talking to him. He's studying the creative word. We're focusing on his capacity, his level of service, and all of a sudden, over time, this stuff started to melt. And as I said, the Baha'i community learned things because we had a humble posture of learning as best we could. He was learning things because we had a humble posture of learning, and we grew together. But now his capacity is a part of the Baha'i community, and we've all grown. You see? And that's just one person. And this is kind of a model of how this thing can work. The story I told you about the junior youth groups, that was another model of how things could work. And I told you yesterday also about the group that wouldn't go to each other's homes. Okay? So what did they do? The tutor in his class, he didn't come down on the people that didn't want to go to each other's homes. What they started to emphasize, they emphasized, and this is, you may not think this could change people, but do we really think the creative word can change people? In the spirit of service, with an outward-looking orientation and fellowship and bonds of friendship, which they kept doing within that study circle. And over time, things started to melt, and they consulted about the racial issues in that atmosphere. The House of Justice said that would be created born of love and trust so that more people can engage. Now you have a whole study circle learning about race, learning about culture, learning about class. The end of the story, and this isn't the end of the story, is this whole group of people go on camping trips together now once a year. They go to each other's homes. They fellowship together. Their kids fellowship together. They're friends. These people consider themselves Baha'is, though none of them have signed their cards, okay, through this process. This is class, race, and culture. This is not a nice, clean, neat thing. I don't want to paint this picture that it's all perfect. But I'm saying within these community-building processes, it's the combination of these community-building processes, the nuances of the spirit that's created by these community-building processes that build capacity in the individuals and build capacity for us to move forward. So I wanted to share that kind of end thing. And, you know, my brother Daniel will be so happy that I shared his story because he is pleased. I want to remind you of the, on my sales pitch, remind you of buying his stuff. I'm looking at my notes to make sure I know there's always one other thing. Oh, here's the other thing I want to say. Ed Peace reminded me of this last night. I don't even know if I knew. But Merry Christmas. But the reason that he reminded us of this is because the Advent of Divine Justice was published December 25th, 1938. So Merry Christmas in the true sense of the word. So I don't really have anything else except for I thought about what Ken was saying in his talk. He wants me to say this. All right, I'm going to say this. You know, when I went to the National Convention last year, I went at the last minute. I wasn't a delegate. And I went because I knew that the National Spiritual Assembly was going to be talking about race. And I had some glimmerings about the February 25th message and the significance of that. I hadn't known what Ken was going to talk about at the convention and the consultation with the House of Justice, all of this. And I was sitting in that room and I was awestruck. I was galvanized, the energy and the spirit in that national convention when he was talking about this. And I encourage you, if you want your community to understand this issue, I encourage people to go to the website, the national website. The talk that he gave at National Convention is there. It helps the community begin to address this and understand it, so I encourage that. But I was so galvanized by that and the energy that came from that, and all I could think of at that time is our Baha'i community needs a badashed moment. We need a badash. We need to turn a corner. We need to break from the conventions of the past. Part of breaking from the conventions of the past is that we are focusing on this issue like we never have before. And we're focusing on it systematically, and we're moving forward. And I'm saying this not to be discouraging, but some people don't want to focus on race. They don't see the significance of it. And some people may not stay with it. But we need to move. We need to accelerate. We need to break from the past with the energy and the urgency that Ken talked about. And I'm not saying this in any way except for the feeling that I had that we need that kind of a moment in the Baha'i community as we move forward. So that's just Tod Ewing's opinion. Ken doesn't necessarily, I didn't share this with Ken.
No, the Assembly, Ruth Prince, is dead serious about this.
Okay.
And would agree with everything that just was said. Yes.
Yes, yes. And so, you said in your talk, where are the Ali Nakjiavanis? Where is Ali Nakjiavani? Where is Ali Nakjiavani in this country? And I think that's a good thing to close and reflect on. Any of us can become an Ali Nakjiavani if we so choose. The person the Guardian said was totally free of prejudice. Jeez. Ya Baha'u'llah Pa. Praise God. Thank you.
Thank you.